Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the week starting on Monday, November the 4th, 2024. So I start this video by just looking at the main events astrologically happening this week, and I then look at my theme of the week, and my theme of this week I think is going to be, it's going to be Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine. I haven't looked at his chart for some time, but I thought we would have an update on his horoscope in light of the fact that he's got a Mars return coming up. It's pretty much happening beginning of the week, his Mars return. So that is something I will be looking at. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to do an I Ching reading for the week. And this I Ching reading, if you don't want to have your I Ching read, you don't have to watch that section of a video. It only applies to those who watch that part of the video. And this I Ching reading will have 4 sections: general, money, business and career, and then relationships. So that's the structure of the video. So let's look at what is happening. So here is the chart for the beginning of the week, midnight on Monday, November the 4th. I've set it for New York. There's no particular reason it has to be set for New York. Of course, just to remind you, if you enjoy this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. And if you're not subscribed and you enjoy the video, I would, of course, be really happy if you would subscribe. Anyway, as far as what's happening this week, inevitably, it has to be a week where lots is happening because there is an American presidential election on Tuesday. So it doesn't matter what the planets are going to be doing, it's going to be a very hectic week. However, if you just look at it astrologically, you could say, well, maybe not so much is happening. Okay, we had a new moon on Friday, and I suppose that new moon kind of sets the scene for the presidential election. In some respects, it is a new beginning. We're at the beginning of a new lunar cycle, and it's not until the very end of this week that we have the first quarter moon. So that's perhaps how we should see the moon. And if you look at the beginning of the week, the positions on Monday, the beginning of Monday, again set for New York, you can see that the sun is in Scorpio, but the moon is in Sagittarius. In other words, the moon was full at 9 degrees 35. Sorry, the moon was new at 9 degrees 35 minutes Scorpio on Friday, and now it's moved on. And so by the beginning of the week, it's in Sagittarius. So that reminds us that this week is a new beginning. And when you have a new moon, and when the moon changes sign from the sign of the new moon, that's perhaps the start of a time when we start to see the first results of that new moon. And if we've got anything planned, we've got anything that we want to get off the ground, it's at this stage that we can start to consider perhaps telling people what we're planning on doing. To begin with that new moon, it's a time of secrecy. But now that the moon is in Sagittarius at the beginning of the week, particularly Sagittarius, it's a very open, quite extroverted placement for the moon. So perhaps it is time to communicate. Now, at the beginning of a week, we do have 2 aspects that certainly are worthy of note. The first aspect we've got is, of course, we have got Mars opposition Pluto. I mean, Mars opposition Pluto, even though Mars is in Leo and Pluto is in Capricorn, that opposition is just past exactitude. That Mars opposition Pluto is going to very much dominate the week. Remember, Mars is moving slowly, even though it has changed sign. It is now in Leo. So, still, the concept of the power struggle, and of course that's stating the obvious. You didn't need astrology to tell you that, did you? Because we got a presidential election. I think it's an important presidential election. We've got two candidates who have very different views, I think, who represent very different approaches. I think, people sometimes say, elections don't matter. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It's all the same. I disagree with that. I remember, the first presidential election I watched, I was really looking at I remember the 1980 presidential election. I was 18, between Reagan and Carter. And I remember someone asked me about it, and I remember saying to myself, it doesn't really matter who wins. I was wrong, and it did matter who won in 1980, between Reagan and Carter. It had a big impact on the United States' direction. To say that elections don't matter, you shouldn't vote because it doesn't matter. Yeah, American presidential elections very often do matter, and I think this election in particular does matter. And it doesn't matter just not just for people in America. It has an impact on the whole world, as I'll be discussing a bit later when I look at Volodymyr Zelensky's horoscope. And we also have another opposition, and we have Venus opposition Jupiter. Now, that Venus opposition Jupiter may have been more of a feature of the end of last week, the sort of Sunday the 3rd, but it's still a feature of the week, particularly the beginning of the week. Venus opposition Jupiter can be about indulgence, taking things too far, spending too much money, being too emotional, eating too much, drinking too much. But it can be enjoyable. That's true, and it's not always bad. But we just always have to know our limits with Venus opposition Jupiter. And then we've got Mars moving into Leo, and that seems like a big change. But we must remember that Mars goes back into Cancer, because on December the 6th. Mars goes stationary retrograde back into Cancer, and and then it's a long time before it finally moves into Leo. I think it's actually the spring. So don't be lulled into a false sense of security with Mars moving out of Cancer into Leo. It comes back into Leo. It goes back into Cancer soon enough. But still, with Mars moving into Leo for the time being, it's a time when perhaps many of us are going to have an ego that is perhaps stronger than usual. Mars conjunct Leo can want attention, can regard itself as being important. And not important in a sort of status way, but just important in terms of getting the attention one wants. And of course, Mars is moving into a fire sign, and now we're getting a lot of stuff in fire signs. We now have Mars in Leo, Mercury is now in Sagittarius, Venus is in Sagittarius. So we've got three personal planets in fire signs. Okay, the moon at the beginning of the week is in Leo, but is in Sagittarius. But the moon is a fast mover. But certainly between now and I think November the 11th, we've got a lot of stuff in fire. Now Venus will be. I think November the 11th, off the top of my head, is when Venus moves out of Sagittarius and into Capricorn. So some of that fire dominance starts to go. But then, of course, November the 22nd, or about around then, you've got the sun moving into Sagittarius. So it's a time when things are quite fiery. And so if you are a fire sign, you've got, you're an Aries or a Leo or a Sagittarius, this could be quite welcome. You might just feel that things are moving again, that you've got your fire, that you're able to make connections. So that is the beginning of the week, and really there's not a huge amount going on astrologically. Of course, I understand there's a lot going on politically. Okay, Monday we have got Sun trine Saturn as well. Sun trine Saturn, it's a nice aspect. I think it helps stabilize things, create some foundations, and perhaps things aren't going to go too crazy with that Sun trine Saturn. And it's in water signs, so perhaps this is a time when we we are emotional, perhaps. We do have strong emotions, but somehow, perhaps, with Sun trine Saturn, we're going to be able to keep some control over things. And from the perspective of the rest of the week, things do sort of settle down a bit. There aren't any really major aspects. I mean, on Wednesday we've got, I think we've got the Sun is... Wednesday we've got the Sun making a biquintile to Jupiter. So, that is... It's an okay aspect. It's not particularly major. Sun biquintile Jupiter. The Sun will be 144 degrees from Jupiter. And that is about style and how we wish to present ourselves and our ideas. We have ideas, and we want to project these ideas onto the world around us, because the biquintile, 2/5 of a circle, is an aspect about the things we create. And so some of us might have this vision that we might want to bring into consciousness, and perhaps actually turn it into reality in the outside world. Then on Friday we've got Venus quincunx Uranus. There's Venus will be in Sagittarius. It will be quincunx Uranus. This is a fairly minor aspect, and with Venus quincunx Uranus, okay, Venus is a planet of relationships. Uranus can be about sort of instability, perhaps, or we're struggling to create variety in our relationships. So maybe with Venus quincunx Uranus, as the week sort of continues with Venus in Sagittarius, some of us might feel bored with the people who we have been spending our time with. Somehow we might feel they're not living up to our expectations, or of course we might not be living up to their expectations. It depends. So there is perhaps this struggle to sort of create new excitement. And then at the end of the week, we've got Sun quintile Pluto. So there's the Sun, there is Pluto. They're going to be 72 degrees apart, 1/5 of the circle. So quintile, I suppose it's the attempt to change things. We have an idea that we might want to create change, and we actually want to turn it into reality. And so we have the idea, and then a challenge is to make it real and to actually enact those changes. But overall, looking at the positions of the planets, perhaps there's a sense, okay, the Mars moves into Leo, but perhaps there's just nothing new happening. We know about what's going to happen this week. We've got the new moon, we've got Mars opposition Pluto, and that's perhaps going to tell us about what is happening this week. And we've of course got this presidential election, and this presidential election was always going to happen. If you looked at a calendar from a perspective of 1793, you knew that there was going to be a presidential election around this time. So it was always going to happen, and perhaps the presidential election, is the event, and many people are going to be impacted by the presidential election, and of course that includes Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, I have not talked about Volodymyr Zelensky for a long time. I mean, there used to be a time when I was completely obsessed by him, where I would talk about him every day, but I got sidetracked by what's going on in the United States and the US election. So I was talking about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump every day, and I sort of forgot about Volodymyr Zelensky. And maybe that's the Gemini in me. Gemini can't think about more than one thing. Two things at once. That's just getting too much. And this whole Gemini thing, by the way, you think about Gemini being about two things, but actually, with Gemini, it can actually be quite difficult even to think about two things. You take two things, and you always think one thing is more interesting than the other. One thing is better than the other. One thing I've got more to say about the other. And Recently I've had more to say about America than Ukraine. But we shouldn't forget Volodymyr Zelensky, because I think the presidential election is going to have an impact on him, and it's going to have an impact on Ukraine. And if you'll forgive me for giving my opinion without backing it up with astrology, I think the election is certainly obviously going to have an impact. And Putin has said that he endorses Kamala Harris. I mean, I don't think he necessarily used those words, but Vladimir Putin says that he wants Kamala Harris to win the election. And of course, I think a lot of people didn't take that seriously. But if you think about it, it is probably in Vladimir Putin's interests for Kamala Harris to win, because Kamala Harris and the Democrats find it impossible to seriously negotiate. They're just not good at it. Antony Blinken, as a Secretary of State, he's hopeless. He's petulant. He's just not able to sit down with people and communicate. And communicate in a diplomatic way, especially if he's dealing with people he doesn't like, for example, the Chinese or the Russians. And the Russians really don't want negotiations. Negotiations are perhaps bad for Russia. They've already been burnt by their negotiations in 2022 with Ukraine, when they met in Istanbul. Now, it might seem that, the bad Russians, you shouldn't negotiate with them. But they did come to a deal. They pretty much signed off on the deal, but the West scuppered that deal. They told Ukraine that they would give them complete support for their war, to continue with that war. Effectively, Ukraine was ordered to end those negotiations. As a result of that, Ukraine lost more territory, and of course it lost hundreds of thousands of its troops. And then I think you have it now part of the Ukrainian constitution, but you cannot negotiate with the Russians unless it's I don't know quite on what the details are. So when there are no negotiations, Russia can talk to people like the Chinese, people who might be wanting peace, who might want negotiation, and say, look, the Americans do not want to negotiate. They are being unreasonable. So it's kind of easier for the Russians if they don't have to negotiate. And if the Americans have this absolute view, it's either Ukraine loses the war, which America doesn't want, or it's a victory for Russia. And a victory for Russia includes Ukraine losing some territory. So with Kamala Harris winning, you're just going to get more of the same. And I think that there aren't going to be negotiations, and Russia is just going to get more and more territory. I think that if Kamala Harris wins, I think it's likely that in the end, for example, Odessa will fall, and the West will continue to be in denial about the reality and what's happening in Ukraine. On the other hand, I think if Trump wins, Trump will... I would guess that the first thing he does when he's elected, he'll make 3 phone calls. He'll probably make a phone call to Putin, he'll make a phone call to Netanyahu, and he'll make a phone call to MBS, the guy in charge in Saudi Arabia. And Trump will create a situation where people are forced to negotiate. I think Trump likes negotiating, and the art of the deal, and he is very transactional. And of course, the neocon narrative is that he's a weak negotiator, that he gives too much away, that he reveals his feelings too much. But if Trump publicly talks about negotiation, it's going to force Russia to the negotiating table. Countries like India and China they don't want this Ukraine war to continue. Trump will put pressure on Ukraine, and I think there'll be negotiations pretty quickly. And as a result, Ukraine will keep more of its stuff. I don't think Odessa will fall, for example, to the Russians if Trump wins. And I think it really is the case that Russia wants Kamala Harris to win. And I think that it just makes things difficult for Putin if Trump wins, because he's going to be forced to a negotiating table. And of course that means that Trump would force the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, because I don't think that Trump is a great friend of Zelensky, really. I think Zelensky's days are numbered if Trump wins, and you're going to need some kind of change of government. I think that will be perhaps forced on Ukraine. But I think it would be in Ukraine's long-term interests, and also in terms of its territorial integrity, for Trump to win. And of course, my view is that if you care about world peace, you should want Trump to win. Of course, if you care about the environment, you might have a different view. But this sort of brings us on to Zelensky. So Zelensky is under pressure, and he has got his Mars at 0 degrees 15 minutes Leo. So that Mars is opposition the Sun, and it is opposition Venus. So no doubt the next few days are incredibly important for him. And that Mars opposition Venus, Mars opposition the Sun, this is someone who has great belief in himself and who is incredibly stubborn, who finds a change almost impossible to contemplate. And I mean, I suppose you could say that the advantage of that is, in terms of the Ukraine war, he's not prepared to negotiate. Okay, he went through the Istanbul negotiations, but once those negotiations had ended, he's just carried on with this war, and perhaps his persistence has short-term in some respects worked well for Ukraine to continue till the end. And as they say, continue to this war until the last Ukrainian. And you look at his chart, just so much stuff in fixed signs: Mars in Leo, Moon in Leo, Saturn in Leo, Venus in Aquarius, Sun in Aquarius. This is not someone who compromises. And his Mars, by the way, is square Chiron. That's perhaps rather difficult. Mars square Chiron. I suppose you could say that Chiron represents the maverick, doing something unusual. And I suppose in his previous incarnation as a comedian, that Mars square Chiron may have worked very well. He was able to do things that were perhaps unexpected, and there was perhaps a bit of a shock value to what he was doing. And perhaps as a comedian, that Mars square Chiron worked quite well. But also Mars square Chiron in terms of a wound, putting his energy into something, putting his energy into the war, and perhaps getting damaged, or at least perhaps his country getting damaged by the continuation of this war. And his Mars. So his Mars, he's got this Mars return coming up. So he's going to have 3 Mars returns over the next few months, but all between now and the spring. So he's going to have a Mars return this week. He's going to have a Mars return in beginning of January, and then he's going to have a final Mars return in April. So let's look at his Mars return coming up on Monday. So Monday, this is his Mars return chart. So this is the time when Mars returns to where it was when he was born. And so Ukraine time, that takes place just before midnight on Monday. You can see Mars is at 0 degrees 15. Now, people don't really do planet returns very often, except they do solar returns, lunar returns. It's quite relatively unusual to do planet returns. There are different ways of looking at this chart. I mean, one approach could be to say, well, he's got Uranus square the ascendant, assuming we've got his time of birth right, and so that Uranus square the ascendant is going to be quite accident prone. It's quite violent. This is someone who perhaps wants to sort of continue with the war, and it's also about shocks. There is a bit of a shock here with Uranus square the ascendant, and so I don't think that's necessarily a disaster, having Uranus square the ascendant. And then you might also want to look at the position of his Mars. Now, you might say that there are some good things going on in this Mars return. Firstly, Leo is rising, and Mars is in Leo, and Mars is in mutual reception with the Sun. So Mars mutual reception with the Sun, Mars is in a strong position, and the Sun is on the IC. So it certainly emphasizes Mars. And does this mean that he's going to be able to assert himself well? Well, Mars is opposition Pluto. We should not forget that. You know, Pluto is about to go into Aquarius. So with Pluto going into Aquarius, you know, that's certainly going to be putting him under a lot of pressure. And as an aspect, Pluto is now within less than half a degree of his Mars, and so over the course of November, Pluto is getting closer and closer to his Mars. Now, this lunar return, which as I said is quite mixed. I mean, maybe that mutual reception between the Sun and Mars, you know, Sun is in Scorpio, the sign of Mars, it's on the IC, may work in his favour. On the other hand, Mars is opposition Pluto. On the other hand, Uranus is square the ascendant. So, yeah, I do think it is somewhat mixed. Then he's got a second Mars return on January the 5th, because Mars is now retrograde, and so Mars retrograde is now it's again just a reminder. He's got Mars is opposition Pluto. Pluto is now in Aquarius by the beginning of January. Pluto is going to be in Aquarius, so Mars in Leo opposition Pluto. That's just a reminder of the sort of drama that he's going to be experiencing. I mean, I suppose things are always dramatic for Volodymyr Zelensky. Moon is on Skeet, and it's conjunct Neptune. That might be somewhat difficult for him, but that's his second. One other thing, Mars return. Perhaps what's more important is the fact that he's got Saturn on the descendant. Saturn represents his rivals, his enemies, and so Saturn is strong. That might mean that his enemies are strong, and you know, Jupiter is square Saturn. You know, and of course he does have a lot of enemies. And his main enemies are probably not the Russians, but what's going on internally in terms of Ukrainian politics. I think it's quite vicious, Ukrainian politics. Allegiances can shift very quickly. And then he's got a third Mars return. I mean, who knows whether he'll still be president at his third Mars return. And that takes place on April the 18th. So April the 18th, Mars at 0 degrees 15, and this is just a general reminder of how long Mars will stay in Cancer. Once it goes retrograde, once it leaves Leo, it'll be in Cancer for a few months, and it's not going to come back into Leo until April. So that's his final Mars return. Uranus is on the descendant, close to the ascendant. Oh, if you're interested, Black Moon Lilith is relatively close to the ascendant. So, he's got Venus conjunct Saturn. Does that matter? I suppose Venus is sextile Uranus. But anyway, just a reminder that he has got three Mars returns coming up. So that's looking at his chart from a Mars return perspective. Then we have to consider the transit perspective. So we'll put, here's Volodymyr Zelensky's chart, and I'll just put it next to, the positions on November the 5th at the time of the presidential elections. So we've got Volodymyr Zelensky in the middle, and we've got the positions on Tuesday on November the 5th, on the evening of November the 5th in the outer wheel. And he's got Gemini rising. Kamala Harris has got Gemini rising. And also, of course, the sun, Donald Trump's sun is about 22 Gemini. So his ascendant triggers important points in both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's chart. And Jupiter, he's got Jupiter crossing his ascendant. And the question is, it is an important question. How is that going to work for him, Jupiter on the ascendant? Now, there are some people who might say, well, Jupiter is going retrograde. It's already actually made the conjunction to the ascendant. And so how is it going for him? Does Jupiter on the ascendant, does it always work well? I think that some have argued that one reason why Kamala Harris is going to win is because she's got Jupiter crossing her ascendant, or has crossed her ascendant. Jupiter is in Gemini, the sign of her ascendant, and also she's got, in terms of perfections, her perfected ascendant has moved forward to Gemini because she's just had her 60th birthday. So many people regard, particularly Hellenistic astrologers, regard Jupiter in Gemini as being very fortunate for Kamala Harris. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has not just had his 60th birthday, and Jupiter is not always a benefic, really, particularly when it's in Gemini. And you could say that Jupiter in Zelensky's chart is ruler of his 7th house. And so you could say Jupiter represents his enemies. I mean, you could say the same thing for Kamala Harris. Jupiter crossing her ascendant is about Jupiter represents her enemies. And perhaps her enemies being strong. But I don't want to talk about my forecasts for the election. You know what they are. That's not what this video is about. So Jupiter's crossing his ascendant. I do think that's important, but the question is it a good thing? And it's not immediately obvious that it necessarily is a good thing because Jupiter is in Gemini. Okay, Jupiter is in mutual reception to Mercury, so that might give Jupiter a certain amount of dignity. So you've got Jupiter in Gemini is in mutual reception to Mercury in Sagittarius. That might help, but certainly something is happening. And in terms of what else is happening, of course, he's got Pluto issues and he's got Mars issues. So if we look at what he's got in his chart, he's got Pluto is about to go into Aquarius. So the moment Pluto goes into Aquarius, it will be opposition his Mars. His Mars, he's already got his Mars return. His Mars, as it starts to move through Leo, is going to make the conjunction it's going to start making an opposition to the Sun, and then it's going to make an opposition to Venus. So Mars goes stationary retrograde on December the 6th, and so that is stationary retrograde opposition his Sun, and that is certainly a fairly violent aspect. And then it's also opposition his Venus. So Mars opposition his Sun Venus conjunction could be difficult. Now, Mars is usually a fast mover. I mean, so Mars will make the opposition to the Sun and it will move on. But because it's moving so slowly, let's look at how fast Mars is moving at the time of at this time. So if this Raphael's ephemeris in the back, it tells you how fast the planets are moving on each day. So on December the 5th or 6th, around this time. Mars is moving about 4 arc minutes a day. It's moving really slowly, and through as you move into late November, it's crawling like a snail. And so Mars is having the quality of an outer planet here. So it's having the power, I think, of, say, a Saturn transit or a Uranus transit at this stage as it moves to the opposition of his Sun and Venus. So I think that Mars opposition Sun and Venus in November, I think it's sort of is this month. Yeah, it's going to be really hard, and I think he's going to be under a lot of pressure. What does this say about the election? I don't know. Well, of course, I have an idea about what it means, but it doesn't really matter who wins the election. The war goes on, and clearly he's going to be under extra pressure short term if Trump wins, because he's going to have to rethink the whole way he is negotiating or not negotiating. And it does mean, if Trump wins, that the Ukraine war, I believe, is coming to an end. I think that a lot of conflicts, I think the Gaza conflict is going to come to an end relatively quickly if Trump wins. It's interesting. There are Arab Americans in Michigan who believe that in terms of saving Palestinian lives, that it is better to have a Trump. It's better to have a Trump victory rather than a Harris victory. And this, as far as I'm concerned, does make sense. Trump makes phone calls. He'll make a few phone calls, and I think that it's going to bring about a more peaceful world. Now that says nothing about what's happening in the US, but I suppose American voters are primarily focused on what happens in the US, and many of them couldn't care less what happens outside America. So maybe that's why some of them will vote for Kamala Harris. But then there is the question of directions, solar arc directions. So solar arc directions. So Zelensky he's 47. He's coming up for his 47th birthday, isn't he? Is that right? He was born in 77. 40. He's 70. No, he's born in 78, wasn't he? So let's just go back to his chart. So here is Zelensky's. He was born in 78, so he's coming up to his 47th birthday. So if you move everything 1 degree for 1 year, so from a solar arc perspective, you would just move all the planets 47 degrees to get an idea about what's happening in his life. So these are his solar arc directions. I've got them somewhere. And so what we want to know is what are those solar arc directions hitting? I don't think we need to have a 90-degree dial like that. Sorry about that. Okay, so on the outer wheel we have Zelensky's solar arc directions. On the inner wheel we have his natal chart. Now, his solar arc directed Mars is interesting. So he's got his natal Mars at 0 degrees 15 Leo. So you move Mars 47 degrees, and that takes it through to 17 degrees 25 Virgo, and it's starting to move towards the fifth house cusp. But most importantly, he's got Neptune at 1731 Sagittarius. So that's pretty exact. So right now he's got solar arc directed Mars square his Neptune, and that suggests to me that from a military perspective, things certainly don't look good. And we know things are not looking good. I sort of had to remind myself of what's going on in Ukraine, and it's almost impossible to work out what's going on just by looking at the Western media. But Russia is making solid advances, and it just continues. I mean, it is a war of attrition, but it's just getting more and more difficult for Ukraine. And I mean, we've got winter coming up. Okay, maybe it's difficult to launch an offensive, but you have to wonder what's happening in Ukraine, from a sort of perspective of how people are feeling and how long can this country continue. I suppose when you've got Zelensky in charge with all those fixed signs, I suppose he's keeping Ukraine in the war, but at what cost? And Mars is making that square to Neptune. So the whole way he asserts himself and asserts his country is all starting to come unstuck. And that may also talk about him making mistakes. Not necessarily just military mistakes, but perhaps political mistakes, and realizing there are things he just can't do. And that's one solar arc direction. And then we also have Neptune. So his solar arc directed Neptune is at 4 degrees 42 Aquarius. So what that means is that his solar arc directed Neptune is moving towards a conjunction of his Sun at 5 degrees 7 Aquarius. It's not exact, but it's certainly within half a degree. So I think with Neptune conjuncted, moving towards the conjunction, solar arc Neptune moving towards the conjunction of his Sun, solar arc Mars moving to a square of his Neptune, we've kind of got double Neptune imagery there. He is slowly getting undermined. And I think that I've been saying, I don't know, is the end nigh? I mean, he's able to keep going. I mean, all these fixed signs, don't underestimate him with all this fixity. He just keeps on and on and on. But I suppose people who've got a lot of fixed planets, they don't bend. They're very inflexible. They keep going, and then they just break. And the question is, when does he reach breaking point? And I think that these Neptune solar arc directions really are not going to help. Anyway, those are a few thoughts on Volodymyr Zelensky, and I now want to look at the I Ching. Just a reminder with the I Ching that if you don't want your I Ching done, you don't have to have it done. This only applies to people who watch the I Ching section of this video. So if you don't want your I Ching done, you can just stop watching the video now. This is only for people watching the video, only for people who continue to watch the video. Anyway, I asked the question, what is the week starting on Monday, November the 4th, going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got, remember, by the way, that this section has 4 sections. It's divided into 4. It's going to start off with a general section, then money, then career, and then relationships. So the first hexagram I got was hexagram 10, which is treading. This is a time when we do have to be very careful. There is a tiger in the room. There's a tiger in the corridor. And the image here is of having to deal with something that is difficult. You leave a room, you go out into the corridor. That's the image I like to use. And there's a tiger sleeping there, sleeping in the corridor. So what do we do? Well, I suppose we're careful. We recognize that there is a danger. And what we absolutely do not want to do is tread on the tiger's tail. And if we tread on a tiger's tail, there's a danger that the tiger bites us. Although the I Ching does actually say if a tiger does bite us, then we maybe survive. I don't know quite what that means. Does that mean the tiger nibbles on us? Or the tiger is perhaps not taking us so seriously that it actually wants to eat us. But it's just a reminder that we're dealing with a situation that is difficult, where we have to tread very carefully and we have to nimbly negotiate the tiger. So I suppose this week we have to ask, where is the tiger? What is the tiger? What is this problem we're having to deal with? And There is one moving line, and the moving line is at the bottom. So this bottom line moves, and this moving line is telling us that we can make progress, slow progress, careful progress, and the important thing is to keep it simple. And we're not trying to get loads of attention, and I think we're perhaps helped by the fact that we're in a somewhat inferior position, because inferior position means it's a bottom line, low position. That may describe us. So being in an inferior position, perhaps we don't attract attention. People don't think that we're worth attacking, but we're worth, I don't know, if a tiger doesn't think we're worth biting. I mean, this tiger in the corridor can't bite everyone, and perhaps a tiger doesn't regard us as being important enough or as threatening enough that it actually needs to bite us. So that's how we get through, and it does look as if we do make progress. Slow progress, careful progress. And then this hexagram moves because the bottom line moves. And we get a second hexagram, and we get hexagram number 6, which is conflict. Well, that's one translation. The Wilhelm translation translates it as conflict. Greg Wincook translates it, I think, as grievance. So there is a conflict. There are people we have to deal with. Not everyone is going to be very cooperative, and we may feel that we're being stopped. And that goes perhaps back to the first line of the previous hexagram. We're trying to make progress, and we are succeeding in making progress. But there comes a point where we can't go any further. We're getting resistance. And we might find ourselves in a conflict situation. But it seems that we have to make a little bit of a fuss. We have to be careful how we make a fuss. It's not about drawing too much attention to ourselves, but if we feel we've got a legitimate complaint, then it's important that we raise this complaint. We're subtle about it, but going back to the previous hexagram of the tiger is not going to bite us, and even if it does bite us, it's probably only going to be a flesh wound, as they say. So it's a situation where perhaps we have to be strong, but not too strong. We have to be subtle. But if you do find you've got a complaint, it's just important that you bring it out into the open. Then there is money. So from a financial perspective, it's not a particularly great week. I mean, it's a week where I suppose we're concerned about money. Money doesn't entirely work in our favour. It can be an irritation, but we also, I think, know that there is something we would perhaps like to accomplish in a financial sense, and perhaps we feel we need to ask for money, or someone owes us money, or we need to do something to make more money. I don't know. I suppose that could relate to work or business or something, but I mean, I do talk about career and business in the next section. So there's something we feel we need to do. I think other people are a little bit sensitive when it comes to financial issues. It's not just us. And so in terms of treading, we just need to be careful. We've got to think about our own financial interests, but we mustn't be too impulsive, demand money left, right and centre. That's not going to win us any favours. But so if we can carefully negotiate our own finances, negotiate our way around particular problems, we should be able to sort of get through and be able to sort of creep past the tiger. And we do have this moving line, and this moving line indicates that by being careful, we're going to make progress. We're going to move towards some of our financial objectives, but slowly. We can't expect everything to come together all at once. And so we do make progress, but only up to a point, because the next hexagram is the the hexagram it moves to is conflict. And so at a certain stage this week, we may find that our financial interests conflict with other people's financial interests, and we may find there is a disagreement, and we have to deal with this disagreement. And it's also possible that financially some of us feel hard done by. We feel that we're being ripped off, or something's being held back, or we're owed money, and it really kind of annoys us. And there are many things we want to complain about, but we will be able to sort of do it in the right way. And I think that we just have to restate what we want, restate what bothers us, just doing it in a sort of slow, careful, deliberate way, and trying our hardest to keep away from an absolute conflict. We don't want a real conflict. If there's a real conflict, we're not going to get anything done. But if we just keep pushing, and we just have to understand that some of the people we're dealing with from a financial perspective, they are difficult. They're not easy, but it does seem that if we go about it in the right way, in the end, we can have our grievances heard. And I suspect that from a financial perspective, the end of a week may end up being sort of better from the beginning of a week. But we are going to have to take an initiative here. We can't just expect money to just appear, or for a financial issue to just resolve. It's not. We're going to have to do something. We're going to have to make progress. We're going to have to get past that tiger. And we just have to just accept the situation, and I suppose be a little bit brave. You don't have to be too brave, but it's not about shouting. It's not about getting angry. It's about just slowly getting people to understand our point of view, even if we disagree with them. And if there can be a little bit of compromise at the end, I think that would certainly be a good thing. And then there's career and business. I don't know whether this is relevant to you. I mean, I suppose it depends. But if career and business is something that is important, then this week we start with this hexagram number 10, treading. So if you're working or you have a business, I'm not saying that things are going to be super easy. There are things you definitely have to deal with, and you have to be very subtle about it. You don't want a conflict. That's the last thing you want. And you also don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. Now, one interpretation of the moving line of treading, because the bottom line moves, it talks about plain shoes. Plain shoes means shoes that are not extravagant. So, and treading is, of course, about walking. It's using your feet. You're not literally your feet, but necessarily. But plain shoes, you're walking on with shoes that are made of plain material, that are not dyed any particular colour. And the fact that if they're not dyed a particular colour, if they were dyed a particular colour, that would suggest some level of power or affluence or wealth, maybe in traditional Chinese society, however many hundreds and hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago. But it's just being modest. I think that's part of it. Not trying to give the impression that you're better than anyone. In fact, in terms of business and work, it may actually be a good idea to give the impression that in some way you are somewhat, I don't want to use the word inferior, but you are humble. You don't attract anyone's attention. You don't make anyone feel that you're a threat. And so if you're working, if you have a job, that is the way to behave. It's not about drawing attention to yourself or claiming that you have any sort of position or authority. You're trying to be modest, and if you are modest, people are not going to overreact. And even if you've got a business, you're trying to find new business, for example. Yeah, sure, you have to advertise your products, but you can still be modest about it. And I suppose if you're having to deal with another person, perhaps consider the social relationship between you. I mean, I know that Britain has a reputation for being obsessed about class, but actually living in America, I actually think class is just as important, if not more important, in America than in Britain. In fact, I think there is a view that American people go on about race in America, but I think class class may be the big deal. So it's not just a sort of British obsession with class. I think if you're in the Americas, I don't know about other countries, but class may be an issue here. And the key point is perhaps in terms of business, you're not trying to pretend that you're above someone else or that you have some higher social station. In fact, if you sort of show that you perhaps got a lower social station to the person you're dealing with, whether it be a client you're trying to get business from, maybe your employer, that's the way to do it. I mean, it may not feel very dignified, but the key thing is to make progress. And so you don't attract any animosity. You have a sort of fairly sort of non-compromise, non-confrontational approach, and that's the way through. And that the tiger keeps slumbering, and we have this moving line, and again, that does certainly suggest progress, modest progress, and then we get this hexagram. It moves to conflict. So, in the end, despite your best efforts in terms of career and business and work, there could be a conflict. There's the potential for a conflict. And the question is, where does that conflict come from? Now, that conflict might actually come from you if you take the view that this hexagram is about grievance. There are things that you're not happy about. If you've got a job, you're possibly not happy about conditions. Maybe you're not happy about what you're being paid. You're perhaps not happy about how you're being treated. And so how you have to raise those grievances, but in such a way that doesn't compromise yourself. And that requires an enormous amount of subtlety. But there is the implication here that if you're modest and you're careful, you can raise your grievances, tell employers or co-workers what's bothering you. You can do it in such a way that doesn't attract animosity. So, really, do consider that possibility. And yes, there might still be conflict, but always look for compromise. There is a way of finding compromise. There is a way of dealing with difficult people, and in such a way that matters don't just disintegrate into sort of an outright war. No, that actually doesn't need to happen. And finally, there is relationships. So relationships, they're not entirely easy. I mean, I suppose this might particularly apply to existing relationships. And of course, I'm talking about all kinds of relationships. But you and the other person maybe don't entirely see eye to eye. And you kind of feel that there are matters that need to be discussed. And at the same time, you might feel that the other person is a bit like a sleeping tiger, and that you have to be careful about how partners are treated, because you just don't know how they're going to respond. And so in terms of the important people in your life, do tread carefully, but of course always look after your own needs. And if you've been treated badly by someone, then that gives us the concept of grievance, and the hexagram that treading moves to is conflict, which can also be translated as grievance. And so if you have got a bone to pick with someone, then maybe this week is the week when you need to pick that bone, when you need to bring this grievance out into the open. You need to tell them what's bothering you, but you have to do it in the right way. It's treading. It's about being very careful about it, being very subtle, bringing things up in a sensitive way, and in that way you'll be listened to, and I think that there will be a resolution. But just remember that the other person, if you're in a relationship, could be somewhat difficult. They have their own way of seeing the world, and there is certainly the potential for conflict there. But there is the conflict. You can see it's not a very balanced hexagram. You've got three unbroken lines at the top, and at the bottom you've got these three lines which represent the abyss. Things could go wrong, but I don't think they will go wrong, because I think that you will know how to behave. Now, in terms of new relationships, and again, this could be any kind of relationship, doesn't have to be romantic, could be a partnership, business partnership, whatever. It may be that you feel that you're trying to bring someone new into your life, if that is the case, and I think that you can be successful. But in terms of new people, and if you're trying to get closer to them, it's about treading. You have to tread carefully. You don't know who you're dealing with. You don't quite know how to behave. You don't know what the rules of engagement are. And so with new people, tread carefully. Do not be impulsive. Just look for cues, and you will be forgiven to an extent if you make a faux pas, but don't make too many faux pas. But it does talk about, in general, the I Ching is talking about progress, slow progress in terms of a relationship. And it's not going to be entirely easy. So if you're involved in a new relationship, things can work, things can start to move, but then we get, with moves to 6, conflict. As soon as you get to know someone, you'll start to realize how you are different and how you respect and don't respect each other. And so there may be a few issues that need to be ironed out. But yeah, conflict sounds difficult, and there may even be grievances that have to be aired. But I think you can do it in the right way. So I think there's an element of choice here in terms of relationships. I mean, it's challenging, but I think relationships at all levels can work this weekend, provided you behave in the right way, and that you're very subtle, but you also need to make sure that you do look after your own interests. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say for this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I would of course be super grateful if you were to subscribe, and if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again very soon.